We'll get started. Good morning, folks, and welcome. Really excited that y'all are able to join us today. I'm joined by Christian Nelson with the Forest Stewards Guild, talking about the forestry for Minnesota birds, making a return to our webinar lineup. I'm Lane Mosier. I'm a forester with the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative. Again, today we're going to be talking about kind of a follow-up to our October webinar with Christian talking about forestry for Minnesota birds, kind of the genesis of the project, kind of what it is. And last time Christian had just kind of an example or sample application sheet on how to actually apply the guidebook. And this time we're going to have a little bit of runway to provide some context in case you missed it or need a reminder. And then we're going to dive into more about applying this broadly. So again, really excited to have Christian return here. I'll be kind of pasting a bunch of stuff in chat. And then just stick around at the end for that CE request link. So again, thanks for joining us this morning. And Christian, take it away.
All right. Can you see my screen? The right one this time?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Lane and SFEC for inviting me back. I think I was last year in October, as Lane said, and it was kind of a preview webinar. We had not finished the book, and a lot has happened in the last about 8 months or so. In May, we got our first hard copies of the book published, and those were out there now. And also, there are digital copies as well, and a couple other supplemental materials that I'll be covering. So, really appreciate the opportunity. Hopefully, we can really get the word out on this, and we've got an interesting audience today. So, I'm excited to get started. I've got about roughly 30 some slides to get through, and I think we'll have some time for questions at the end. So again, my name is Christian Nelson. I am with the Forest Stewards Guild, which is a national nonprofit, ecological forestry-based agency, non-governmental nonprofit agency, formed in about the 1990s. And the map shows the little guild symbols kind of show where we're based out of. We've got staff in the Pacific Northwest. The headquarters is in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with a number of staff there. There's a Lake States, Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin contingent, as well as some folks in the Southeast and the Northeast as well. So we have staff everywhere. And basically, the Guild advocates for forest stewardship and ecological forestry to the benefit of nature and people. Today, I'm going to talk about, over the next, say, 45 minutes or so, the Minnesota Forestry for Birds program, and specifically kind of what prompted it, what's going on with bird populations, a little bit about the Minnesota Forestry for the Birds history and the sort of the creation and timeline briefly, a little bit of content overview of what's in the guide, and then we'll look at some specifics. We'll drill in and drill down a little bit into forest habitat types, as well as the birds that we focused on for this guidebook. Some important habitat features, which I'm really excited about. That's kind of the meat and the potatoes here. We'll do a sample forest assessment, which anyone could do, and it will really help walk us through some of these forest habitat type elements, and also how to interpret the results then of when you go out in the woods and you start looking at your woods and you start assessing it. So as many of you know, birds have been in trouble for quite some time. Roughly 1 in 4 birds have disappeared since about the 1970s. So that's about 1 billion forest birds in particular have basically disappeared or declined in population. You can see from the side graphics, eastern forest birds are, especially something like a wood thrush, 60% of them are now gone compared to the 1970s. And some other birds are doing even much more poorly. The evening grosbeak has lost about 90% of its population since the 1970s. So about 9 in 10 lost. There are a lot of different factors, and that's kind of important, but some of the examples of factors that are contributing to the decline in bird populations would be habitat loss on their breeding grounds. So for us, that would be in Minnesota. Also, their wintering grounds. Each bird, depending on how they migrate, winters in different areas. I'll get to that in a little bit. There's land cover fragmentation, changing forest demographics as forest composition, structure, age change, as things age, as things are cut. There's invasive species problems, buckthorn up in northern Minnesota for sure, actually a lot of Minnesota as one forest species example. Emerald ash borer, of course, is another big one. There's climate change factors leading to all kinds of things like asynchrony, where birds are showing up maybe before the insects are out, or things are fruiting before they can be pollinated, resulting in a lack of food source and berry production, things like that. There's declining insect populations. Just before the webinar got started, Eli and Lane and I were talking about the bizarre sort of lack of mosquitoes up here this year already, July, second week of July, and still no mosquitoes. Different areas are sort of getting mosquito revenge, though, I hear. People are being carried away by them in some places. There's things like West Nile virus, power lines, cell phone towers, glass buildings, light pollution, predation, especially things like cats. But it's important. This third bullet point is very important in that some species are increasing, some are stable, and our quarter are declining. And it's not just long distance neotropical migrants, say birds that go down into Central and South America or the Caribbean, things like that. And the reason why that's so important, because if we see declines in short distance and year-long or year-round resident birds, then we can say that it's not just habitat loss, say in Brazil or somewhere in Central America, but we can point to other factors going on, maybe closer to home. There is a really interesting report you can read. I don't have the link to the newest one. I think 2024 is out there, but the University of Minnesota's Natural Resource Research Institute, NRRI, Avian Ecology Lab has done annual surveys, I think since the 80s, in both the Chippewa National Forest in north central Minnesota and the Superior National Forest in northeast Minnesota, uh, repeatedly surveying birds every spring for years and years and years. So we have sort of really good trend information. And if you really want to look at individual bird species and sort of population trends, I would recommend reading that report. Or you could try to find the 2023 or 2024 report. The details might have changed, but the trends would still be about the same. So in Minnesota, we know that many bird species are declining. There's a local solution, which is habitat improvements, which can help boost reproductive success. So birds come up here to breed, and the things that we do to help them be successful in raising young and getting those young into their next life cycle is basically the best that we can do here locally. And so it provides an opportunity for land managers, owners, landowners, to basically employ scientifically backed forest management recommendations to do what we can. And so overall, the Forestry for Minnesota Birds program goals are to provide habitat and silvicultural recommendations, especially habitat recommendations, to promote the connection between the bird habitat and working woodlands. And also, of course, what we're really trying to do here at the end of the day is make meaningful, beneficial changes to on-the-ground forest management for the benefit of birds. So we're hoping that we have a publication that can be implemented, that we have interest to basically have people employ some of these things and hopefully benefit birds. The program is more than just this guidebook. It's things like this webinar. It's things like workshops, which we just did at the Cloquet Forestry Center a couple of weeks ago for our sort of inaugural kickoff. That was really fun. I'm just going to go into a brief timeline about how this whole project basically got started. And we have to go way back to about 2008 or so when some states in the Northeast, like Vermont and Maine, for example, started making guides similar to the one that we produced. And basically, it was an effort then to promote quality forest management for the benefit of songbirds. In 2018, the Forest Stewards Guild hosted with Aiken County Forestry a program out of, I think it was the Longleaf Conservation Center, a little bit north of, not Vermont, Aiken, and near Palisade. And there was a lot of interest in that workshop. That was one of the first in-state workshops that I know of that was specifically looking at forest management for birds. That got a lot of people talking, including Mike Lynch with the Forest Stewards Guild. He's the Lake State's director. Alexis Grindy, who is a wildlife ecologist and research coordinator with the Avian Ecology Lab, University of Minnesota. Started looking at funding. We're having a hard time getting the funding. Finally, in about 2023, a grant from the Upper Mississippi Great Lakes Joint Venture uh, and a partnership between the Forest Stewards Guild and American Bird Conservancy sort of came together to sort of get me hired to start working on this publication full time. Peter Deezer with American Bird Conservancy and Peg Robertson, now retired with the U.S. Forest Service, did a lot of work to sort of get a planning and steering committee together, which we'll get into in a moment. Ultimately, we came up with about 20 some people working together for probably a year and a half, kind of at a brainstorming phase and then a writing phase and an editing phase to get a guidebook actually published. And here we are today with a guidebook published and some supplemental materials, hard copies, digital copies, and programs like this. Again, it took a lot of people. Here is the list of names that were on the planning and steering committee. And I think one of the take homes here is that we just have an awful lot of diverse expertise gathered around the table. We had academic interests from the University of Minnesota, for example. We had bird experts from the University of Minnesota's Natural Resource Research Institute, Avian Ecology Lab, as I've mentioned. Also the Ruffed Grouse Society, the Audubon Society, American Bird Conservancy. We had boots on the ground foresters, county foresters, DNR, and some non-governmental agencies as well. A lot of great editing work for this book came out of the University of Minnesota, Anda Bellamy, and really great graphic artists. So it kind of took a village to get this out, and here's what we produced. So this is a screenshot of some contents that are this is actual screenshot of the table of contents. And you can see that we've got content that's basically what's going on with Minnesota's birds, a little bit about Minnesota's biogeography and bird species diversity, text about forest ecology and management, forest habitat types, how to manage bird-friendly forests, the bird species that we've chosen, why manage forests, information about more forest habitats for Minnesota birds, some silvicultural systems, some tweaks, landscape level considerations. And then we've got a ton of information that we have put into the appendices as well. It's kind of supplemental, but it's really great information. So habitat feature information, ecology, forest habitats, native plant communities, extensive glossaries for anyone not familiar with the terms, additional resources, and a forest habitat assessment worksheet. Ultimately, what we were hoping to do with this book is to make a guidebook that was informative and interesting to professional foresters and land managers and wildlife ecologists, while also having a book that was understandable to sort of the layperson, the common landowner. So we have some technical jargon, but we define it, and we try to keep things understandable to a broad audience. And the idea is we just want to get this information into as many people's hands as possible, and for people to sort of see the importance of this work. And hopefully landowners that are interested in one thing can say, oh, I can do some other things. Consultants that are working with landowners can say, hey, have you considered this? Landowners can go back to consultants and say, hey, I really want to do some of this bird-friendly forestry. How can we make this happen? And all of this is ideally compatible with whatever your goals were, forestry, economic interests, and things like that. I'm going to talk now a little bit about why Minnesota is kind of in a unique situation. Minnesota is home to 4 different ecological provinces. 3 of them are primarily forested. Anything that's on this map that is, let me see if I can use this laser pointer. Anything that is not orange, this prairie parkland, is basically some type of forest. It's not necessarily contiguous forest, as there is, of course, development in cities and towns and parks and agriculture and things like that interspersed in these areas. But if I want to call attention to the forest bird species richness chart, and especially this red color, which basically means you've got more birds in a given area than other areas comparable to it. So this is blue over here, and this is blue, showing that there are a few birds, but of course there are a few forest birds because there's very little forest in the Dakotas. So I really want to draw your attention to something like the Southeast. This is a heavily forested area, uh, very nice forest, but notice that they don't have the diversity that we have straddling this kind of boreal forest, northern Minnesota forest, just this upper line. And there's a number of different things um, that probably play a role in that. For example, we have diverse forests here in Minnesota. Something like 71 different species have been documented in the state. And we also have, other than the mosquitoes this year, we have abundant insects, which is food for breeding birds and the young of breeding birds. And we also have long days, 16 hours of daylight or more, which is provides ample opportunity, especially for your non-nocturnal bird species, to feed their young. So it's just a great environment for raising young, and we have a lot of forests. Interestingly, this is a really interesting quote, I think, in that it came actually out of a prairie book. Uh, but birds may not be the best botanists, and they probably care more about the structural diversity of their habitat than the actual species diversity of the habitat. And if you start to think about that, that's very different than how foresters typically think of forests, because we think of species and groups of species, suites of species and forest types, probably first, and structure is kind of an afterthought for some things, unless there's a silvicultural importance to it. So we had some choices to make when we were thinking about how do we take 18 million acres of forests and three different ecological provinces and write some text and some content that would be easily understandable, reasonably short in length and concise, and would speak to how birds see forests, but also how forest managers and land managers are ultimately going to manage those forests, given that us as foresters, we know that different species live different ages. They need different light requirements, different soil requirements, and climatic requirements. They have different threats. They have different value to wildlife in terms of their ability to say to remain standing after they've died, for example, becoming quality habitat trees and things like that, cavity trees. So what we tried to do was try to find forest habitat types that were meaningful to foresters and birds. And what we came up with was four primary forest cover types for the state of Minnesota: lowland conifers, which are things like black spruce, northern white cedar, and tamarack; lowland hardwoods, excuse me, lowland hardwoods, which we broke down into two subtypes. The black ash subtype, which in Minnesota, black ash tends to be a monoculture forested wetland species, which is why emerald ash borer is a unique threat. And a particular threat in Minnesota is because we have so many of these sort of monoculture wetlands. And then a bottomland type, which is found more often along rivers and things like that, especially as you go into some major rivers in central and southern Minnesota. So this would be species growing along riverbanks like American elm, again with ashes, black and green ash, big cottonwoods, silver maples, things like that. So floodplain forests. The biggest category we have is simply called upland deciduous and mixed conifer, and we had three different subtypes here. There's the aspen birch subtype, especially prevalent in northern Minnesota; the oak subtype, especially prevalent in central and southeastern Minnesota; and the northern hardwood type, which is a suite of species, often sugar maple, basswood, yellow birch, things like that growing together. Lastly, we had upland conifers, which would be your pine species such as jack pine, red pine, white pine. They're all slightly different silvicultural um, have silvicultural properties, but we have lumped them together. And here's an example of the content that you will find in the guidebook about each of those four forest types and the subtypes. So for example, here's a screenshot of content for the lowland hardwood habitat association type. This will give you information about the two subtypes, the black ash type and the bottomlands type, the species that are prevalent there, kind of how to identify it, kind of where it's found, some information about how prevalent it is in the state, a little bit of ecology and natural history, sort of how these forests came to be and sort of how they maintain themselves, what other wildlife species utilize these sites. So not just necessarily the birds that we're going to be focused on, but other wildlife and other birds maybe that we haven't covered. Excuse me. So that is how we took 18 million acres of forests and sort of distilled it down into something meaningful and something that we could put in a book that would be useful and silviculturally meaningful to forest managers. Now, how do we choose birds? Minnesota has about 250 species to choose from. If you look across the entire state, including non-forested. So we had to come up with some selection criteria to whittle down 250 bird species down to something that we could fit in this book. So immediately we kind of threw out the birds that don't utilize forests. So now we're down to 150, which is still a lot, 150 bird species of forest utilizing birds in Minnesota. We wanted to choose birds that had a relatively wide geographic distribution. So birds that are covered in this book hopefully could be seen in most places, most forested places of the state. We wanted them to be basic habitat specialists, so birds that are pretty found primarily in certain types of forest types, not kind of generalists that are found everywhere. Like you might find a robin in a backyard, a city park, or a red pine plantation, for example. We wanted a mix of relatively common species, but also some species that are particularly declining and are on the species of greatest conservation need list. We wanted birds that seem to respond to different management techniques. And so when you change the forest, the birds might also utilize the site differently from that point forward. Again, not generalists. Birds that are relatively easy to ID so that people that aren't necessarily bird enthusiasts that can ID any bird by sight or sound can still pick up a guidebook or something like the Merlin app and figure out what they're looking at. And so we sort of took those criteria, took our 4 primary forest types and 7 subtypes, and found birds, 18 of them, to go into each to basically serve as ambassadors or representatives essentially of each of our forest types. So I'm not going to read these all off, but you can see we've got 18 birds and then we've got a couple birds in most of the types. Unsurprisingly, we have the most birds in that broad upland deciduous and mixed cover type because we have those different subtypes. And I just wanted to call attention quickly to anything that is underlined in red. Let's see if my laser pointer is still working. Those would be species of greatest conservation need. And so these are birds that are in particular decline. And so you can see we've got roughly half of our birds are sort of imperiled in some way, and another half are doing a little bit better. Here is an example of content that you will find about all 18 birds. So there are 18 boxes like this in the guidebook, and you will find a nice picture of it and a little bit of background about it, how they do, how they migrate, where they're primarily found, how they kind of forage, a little bit of information about maybe how they do their territories and things like that. In the center part of the box, you'll find things with population status. So there are a couple different metrics that we looked at, or a couple different sources. So, for example, range wide basically means wherever the bird is found breeding, and so that could be well outside of Minnesota for some species. We wanted to see how those trends look in Minnesota, so we used again some of the NRI long-term population study data, as well as some other information for birds that are outside of those 2 forests in northern and north central Minnesota to sort of look at population trends. So for example, this pileated woodpecker on the left side of the screen is actually doing pretty well, both range-wide and in the state of Minnesota. PIF, that stands for Partners in Flight, they've got their own metrics to sort of define if a species is stable or not. So in this case, it's a species of low concern in the Partners of Flight metrics. It's not a species of greatest conservation need. And climate vulnerability predictions based on things like tree species changing doesn't look like it's going to necessarily negatively impact pileated woodpeckers as much as it might some other birds. There are community associates listed, so these are birds that you might find in similar habitat type as you would find a pileated woodpecker. And lastly, there are actually not lastly, second to lastly, there are habitat features and management recommendations. So if you are really interested in something like a pileated woodpecker or ruffed grouse, you can look at this and say, what do they need specifically? How can I implement that? And they're very short, 3 or 4, 5 recommendations oftentimes for kind of little tweaks or attributes in the forest that would benefit these birds. And then now lastly, this graphic down here shows the overstory, midstory, and the understory layers of a forest. Some forests might not have necessarily well-developed layer, all 3 layers being well-developed. A young forest, for example, that doesn't have any residual trees left might only be small understory trees, essentially seedlings and saplings at some point. But as a forest grows and matures and you get sort of more complexity and structural complexity, this kind of shows where this graphic here shows where the bird nests. This is a symbol for a cavity and where it tends to feed. So pileated woodpeckers are most often found kind of right in the middle of the canopy. I'll see them drilling trees down low sometimes too, but for the most part, they're off the ground a little bit, but they're not up in the canopy. Whereas contrast that with a ruffed grouse that spends most of its time on the ground, although they do get up into treetops to feed and eat on birch buds and things like that. Um, So now you've got information about forest types and 18 different birds and their associated species and some other wildlife that goes into these forest types. The guidebook is also going to provide you with some information about how to manage forests. And this is not specific to managing forests for birds necessarily. These same sort of 6 steps would be typical of any sort of forest management process, where you basically start with what are your objectives and your goals, including any sort of wildlife or habitat goals. This is a process that can be revisited. I'll explain that in a moment. Step 2, and we're going to do a little sample walkthrough of this, is to assess the current habitat condition. So you have to know what you have. What species do you have? What other sort of habitat elements do you have that are of interest to birds in particular? Um, and you're maybe wanting to look at an individual forest stand, maybe zoom out a little bit to the entire property if the stand is smaller than the property boundaries, for example, and then zoom out some more to say what's within, say, a mile of it or 2 miles of it. So how does this all fit into the larger landscape? So if I've got 20 acres of pine surrounded by no other pine, then this 20 acres of pine is particularly important. If I've got 20 acres of pine surrounded by 2,000 acres of pine, then maybe we can start to look at some diversity that would include species that aren't necessarily pine, if that was our goal. And the next step is to determine the desired future condition of the forest, and this can be a couple different timelines. So you could look at maybe immediately after some sort of action, or you can look long term, 20 years from now, 60 years from now, 200 years from now. Have multiple ideas about sort of how you want to see that forest progress based on what you've got, including the habitat and soil native plant community conditions that will sort of inform you about what's possible on that site, what was historically there, what could theoretically be there, especially with climate change and things like that. So now that you know kind of what your goals are, what you have, kind of where you want to go with it, you can start writing a plan. How am I going to get there? This is going to sort of detail what you have. It's going to detail um, how how you want to get to where you want to go. And hopefully this number 5 is where this guidebook really comes into play, this 4 and 5 really, which is how are we going to incorporate some important habitat elements for birds in our forest management plans. And then after we actually implement something, let's go out there again. Similar to step 2, let's reassess what actually has been done on the ground post some sort of management activity, or maybe post no management activity and some time has elapsed, things like that, and adjust the plans as necessary. So maybe we ended up with fewer snags than we want. Is there something that we want to do about that? Maybe there's fewer trees, coarse woody debris, large logs on the ground than we wanted. Is there something we can do? So it's kind of a circular. This whole diagram is circular, and really you could sort of almost draw arrows so that it can go clockwise and counterclockwise as you sort of do these steps, reassess them, tweak them in almost an iterative process at some point. Here is an example of, I really like this graphic, and we're hoping to turn this into a whole poster if we can. But a couple different things I want to point out on this graphic. So these are our 18 birds and kind of where they would live in the woods. And the way this is drawn is birds that are sort of found on the left-hand side of this graphic tend to favor things that have more conifer species, pines and spruces, firs, things like that. And things way to the right are something that has maybe fewer conifer species or no conifer species and is primarily dominated by hardwoods. And then you've kind of got this transition. And then you also have a vertical component here, the understory, mid-story, and overstory, and kind of where these birds tend to sort of hang out. Birds have a way of sort of separating themselves in their ecological niche to avoid competition and sort of maximize the amount of food available to them. So you might have birds that feed in the canopy of a tree, the mid layer of a tree, and near the base of a tree. So one tree, three different sort of unique habitats depending on the bird. The other thing that I want to point out with this graphic that I think is important is that if you only had conifers, then you would probably have fewer of these birds over here on the right-hand side. If you only had hardwoods and you didn't have conifers, you would start to lose these birds that are over here on the left side. If you only have large trees and you really don't, and it's a very park-like environment with not much mid-story or understory, you might lose some of these birds that tend to hang out a little bit lower in the sort of smaller tree, shrub areas or on the ground. So it's very important to know that there's always trade-offs with any sort of forest management. Any stand necessarily is going to favor something kind of at the expense of something else. And so you can't have necessarily one piece of property do everything for every bird. That's where that sort of landscape level information really comes into play, where you can say, what do I have here that's unique that isn't really well represented on the landscape? And is there an opportunity for us to sort of enhance what we've got here and basically make better quality bird habitat for the birds that are maybe lacking on the landscape? I have mentioned that there are important habitat features for Minnesota forest birds, and this is not in the guidebook, but this is available as a supplemental brochure. I don't have access to the chat box. I'm not sure if these links are being posted, but this graphic in particular is in a 3-page trifold brochure that we have created. It's pretty cool. So it's basically a way to sort of look at 10 very important habitat elements that we've identified. And so you've got canopy gaps. So these are holes in the tree canopy, anything from a quarter acre up to maybe an acre or two in size. A canopy gap allows more sunlight to reach the forest floor than in an area that has a dense overstory. And so you might end up with more sunlight on fruit-bearing shrubs and things like that. And if they were in full shade, they wouldn't produce as much fruit. Some species that are shade intolerant might decline if they don't have a little opening to grow up in. Many trees will utilize these gaps to start germinating seeds and seedlings and saplings and basically get a new young tree growing. So canopy gaps can be very important to providing not only structural diversity, but also areas that some birds will feed in a process called hawking, which is where they'll basically hang out at the edge of a gap and then they'll watch a bird fly or an insect fly by, reach out, grab it, fly back. And so those gaps provide sort of little feeding areas as well for certain birds. There's vertical structure, which is the sort of just the arrangement of how everything is. And we'll sort of figure out how to assess that a little bit in our assessment worksheet. Large diameter trees are important to a number of species, not only because they provide sort of structure, perching areas, feeding areas, nesting areas, but they can also, if they have cavities, they can form very large cavities, which can benefit some of your bigger cavity nesting birds, like pileated woodpeckers, for example, and a number of other wildlife species might be flying squirrels found in a tree cavity. Porcupine might spend some time in one. Martins, things like that. Um, Horizontal structure is basically how things are laid out across the ground. Do you have a very uniform um, sort of one area of the stand looks the same as the next in terms of how everything's laid out, or do you kind of have this complicated mosaic and sort of a just variety basically? Because again, variety of these different habitat elements is key to providing better habitat for more birds. Conifer inclusions are important for a number of different species and non-bird species as well. So these are just little pockets of, they might be balsam fir pockets or spruce or pine, but they often provide in the summer important areas of shade. In the winter, they'll provide areas that might have a little less snow cover. So that might make foraging for seeds, for example, easier for when the rest of the forest is covered in a foot of snow or more. So a seed source, predator cover, shelter from weather, conifer inclusions could be very important and easy to implement and get going on certain habitat types. Snags and cavity trees are, of course, very important. These are your standing dead trees that have cavities. Again, I sort of talked about the value of a tree hole for different birds. That'd be an example of that. Downed woody material. This is things laying on the ground. So anything, a ruffed grouse, for example, would find a drumming log very important to breeding because that's how they get up. They flap their wings, they make their booming sounds, and that's how they attract a mate. But down trees provide a number of different sort of microhabitat elements for things like salamanders, frogs, different fungi. Down logs can provide sort of a rotting seed bed for certain tree species, like yellow birch, for example, really likes to grow on what are sometimes called nurse logs. These are down trees on the ground. The size and length of these down trees can matter. So rough grouse would prefer a larger tree, not just little twigs, baseball bats, but a big diameter tree that they can sort of run around on. Red squirrels will take advantage of down trees and sort of use them as above snow line highways to get around in the winter a little bit more quickly. Invasive species are not an important feature. That's why I've got this little red slash here. Just be aware of them and do what you can to control them before management, after management, during management, things like that. There's some things that you can treat, like invasive plants, some things that are going to be much more difficult, for example, emerald ash borer. Leaf litter and duff can be important, especially in hardwood stands. Earthworms are probably the biggest threat to reducing the amount of leaf litter and duff. The leaf litter and duff from a bird standpoint just provides a lot of microhabitat for bird insects to crawl around in. A food source for like American woodcock, for example, is often probing leaf litter, things like that. Fox sparrows, a number of veeries, a number of birds are sort of hopping around, overturning leaves and looking for insects that live in them. And if you don't have enough leaf litter or duff layer, there are some things you can do, like growing larger canopy trees that will provide more leaf litter. But earthworms are a tough critter to deal with, but it's something to be aware of. And then riparian areas. These aren't something that most people are going to necessarily create, but if you have them, whether they're vernal ponds or permanent ponds, small streams, lakes, wetlands, things like that, they all provide very important habitat type. This is a table that is in the guidebook. It's basically the same thing. It's just a little bit more text, but I want to draw your attention down to the quote at the bottom of this by Josh Bednar. He is a wildlife ecologist at the University of Minnesota's NRI Avian Ecology Lab and has been one of the key surveyors in some of these long-term bird survey efforts for years and years and years on the Chippewa and the Superior National Forest. We had a workshop at the CFC I mentioned, the Cloquet Forestry Center, just a couple weeks ago, and he said that for each habitat element found, so any of these 10 habitat elements, for every one of these that are found in your woods or that you can create or maintain, you'll add roughly 5 additional bird species. So that kind of goes to show just how important these little habitat features are in a given forest. Here is an example of some of the text that is in the guidebook as well. So if you want a little bit more information than sort of those sentence or two that was in that table, there is more in the, I mentioned the appendices are full of information. Here's an example of some information that we expanded on and put in the appendix. So next I would like to do a sample walkthrough. Pretend we're in this woods. It's a beautiful woods. Hopefully it doesn't look like this time of the year. This is a fall picture. But let's pretend we're going to take this forest habitat worksheet that is in the book and also available as a separate PDF on our website and use it to assess your forest. So here, I'll give you a moment to sort of look this over. I'll go over this all, but in the interest of sort of you taking it in, it's basically just a sample sheet. If you are a professional forester, a wildlife manager, a consulting forester, feel free to take the elements of this that you like and incorporate them into your own systems. Everyone has their own databases, their own ways of housing information, their own ways of doing a forest assessment and timber cruising. This is one way to do that, and we hope that you will take, if you don't use the sheet specifically, that you will take concepts from the sheet and sort of incorporate them into some of the work that you do in the woods to help you assess these important habitat elements that you might not otherwise capture in your ordinary forest inventory. So we've got the date, and I think one of the last webinars, this is called the sample. It's just generically called the sample forest, but we sort of we made it more interesting. We called it the sample forest, so very exotic. A stand ID, that could just be anything that will help you remember what woods you're talking about. So it might be stand number 1, it might be behind John's tree stand woods, whatever helps you remember it. You can estimate the size if you know it, or use Google Earth or GIS software or something like that to estimate the stand size. As you walk through the forest, you're going to want to make note of what would you classify this forest type as? What are the dominant tree species here? And what is the dominant forest type? And if applicable, forest subtype. So in this example, we're walking through, I'm going to go back one page. We're walking through this woods, and we've got an upland deciduous northern hardwoods forest. So upland deciduous mixed is the primary type, northern hardwoods is the subtype. Um, got space here to sort of list what your primary species are. If you know the height of it, you can estimate that. You can use different tools like a clinometer or something like that to estimate the tree height. This is for your own reference. This might have been captured in your other forest assessment process anyhow. An average diameter, average age if you know it, the native plant community if you know it. The Minnesota DNR has a lot of really good information on how you determine that. We've got resources for where you find those resources and also some information about sort of more information in the appendices about what a native plant community is. But it's really going to help inform what the possibilities are for the site and how well suited a given tree species is for the soil and climatic conditions that are present there. So now that's sort of just the broad general picture of what your forest looks like, your forest stand. Now we're going to start to get into the process of looking at some of these 10 habitat elements. So we're going to start looking at gaps, and we're going to kind of quantitatively assess, how many small gaps do we have? How many medium gaps? How many large gaps? It's not super important that you nail these categories necessarily, just that you have a sense of, do I have gaps, one of those important habitat elements or not? Then start looking at your overstory, midstory, understory, and ground layer plants. What's there? How abundant is it? Do I have a well-developed overstory? Do I have a sparse overstory? How much cover does it have? There's a little cheat sheet for on the back sheet, which we'll see in a moment, for estimating how much canopy cover you've actually got. Softwood inclusions, those are those conifer inclusions I talked about. Do you have some? Do you not have any? If you don't have any, so for example, in this stand, didn't see any conifers observed in the stand. So that would be an opportunity for us to go in and maybe plant things or to look for little seedlings and do what we can to sort of foster their growth, things like that. start to look at snags, the amount of standing dead trees out there. Do we have big ones, small ones? Are they of a high quality species? Again, there's sort of a cheat sheet about what makes a good snag based on how long will it last and how long will it remain standing, sort of some general guidelines there. Also on the back sheet, we'll see that in a second. As you're walking through the woods, you can sort of assess what kind of downed wood do you have on the ground. Do you have large logs, small logs? Is it abundant? So for example, here, we basically said we really don't have a lot of large logs in this forest. Maybe this forest was managed, everything was basically cut, not a whole lot on the ground. You've got a younger forest where small things have sort of self-pruned and called themselves and are now lying on the forest floor, but you have an absence of large logs, which is going to um, provide, it's going to be a lack of habitat then for things like ruffed grouse, but also that climate that I was talking about that it benefits things like invertebrates and salamanders and fungi and tree seedlings and things like that. Leaf litter depth. If you're in a conifer stand, you can sort of ignore this, but you can just sort of say, do I have more or less than about an inch and a half thick of leaf layer, a leaf litter layer? So, and then lastly, for the assessment, let's look at the back side of this. We're going to just note, do we have any water features, wetlands, streams, things like that? In this instant, we didn't have any. Do we have any invasive species that we should be aware of? So on this sample forest, we've got buckthorn in the northeast corner, and we've got several seed-bearing buckthorn and seedlings. So we know that we've got a problem where our buckthorn are maybe going to be spread because they're producing seeds. So we might have a different kind of strategy that way. We might want to be aware of when we're bringing in equipment that there are opportunities for that equipment to sort of transport these buckthorn berries around if we don't do something with that or pay special attention to that in the first place. If you are a bird enthusiast, and especially this time of the year, May, June, July, you can listen, watch. You can take the Merlin bird app on your phone and fire that up while you're walking through the woods and just make note of what you hear. So that will help you know what's in your woods, and you can maybe refer back then to what the guideline has to say about those specific birds, not just the forest habitat type. Um, so that'll also be sort of interesting baseline information theoretically. How does that list of birds change as you implement different management strategies or as time elapses? There's an opportunity on this sheet to just note any sort of other wildlife that you might find, and then some landscape level notes. So again, these are areas kind of zoom out back from your stand of interest, whether it's, again, a stand, your property, or whatever it might be, to zoom out and just paint a picture of what's around here. So in this sample forest, we've got a 10-acre sort of grass pasture to the west, lowland conifer swamps to the south. We've got young aspen with very few snags or anything on the ground. Also adjacent to the site. So we kind of know, okay, we've got some young forest. We have some conifer swamp to the south, but we still maybe have room for conifer inclusions on our stand. We know we've got some, big openings, some grass pasture. We might want to feather the edge of our forest where it sort of butts up against this pasture to the west so that you don't have a very hard wood line. You can feather it, which basically means leaving a few trees and sort of not having that hard edge. That'll benefit some species. Also, there might be an aesthetic consideration there theoretically. Down here is just some reference material. So here is a way to sort of just eyeball canopy cover. So if you've got just anything where you've got very sparse trees cover, just a few leaves as you sort of look up at the sky, you might be down in this low canopy cover category. If you've got, very dense forest, it's practically, you almost want a flashlight in the woods at noon, might have very high canopy cover. Here is a sheet that is also present in the guidebook, but I have included it in this habitat assessment worksheet to just sort of help you gauge what the best trees are based on sort of wind firmness and longevity, rot resistance, and things like that. Ultimately, I think this was sourced from the Minnesota DNR. Here's just a way to sort of visualize acres in terms of like how many feet it is, the dimensions, circular or rectangular, because sometimes it's often hard to sort of estimate acreage out in the woods itself, especially if you aren't using GIS software. And here's just a sort of reminder of these 10 important forest habitat elements. Okay, so that was pretty fast, but so we've walked through our woods. We have determined that we have a upland deciduous mixed northern hardwood stand, sugar maple and basswood. We don't have a very well-developed mid-understory layer, so we've kind of got big trees and then some ground layer and not much in the middle. We don't have any softwood inclusions, and there aren't a lot of snags necessarily. Those are some of the take-homes. Also, not a lot of downwoody debris. Oh, I guess I should have switched this slide. So our goal here in this sample forest example is that we're trying to create a sugar bush, which is basically a stand that we want to tap for maple syrup in the spring. And we also want to do that in a way that maximizes sort of the songbird friendliness of that forest. So we know we have a northern forest hardwood stand, and within the guidebook, we now have access to information about the ecology and natural history, climate and climate change trends of northern hardwood forests in the state, the native plant community systems that are sort of part of northern hardwood stands and sort of drives these systems, information about that. Some other birds, not just the focal birds, but other birds that might live in this type. And then in that section on northern hardwood stands, we also have a list of management tweaks. We know we picked up a wood thrush when we were listening for birds. So in the guidebook, under wood thrush, you'll find information about the biology, ID, its habitat, what kind of, is it a long distance, short distance, resident bird in terms of migration? Where does it nest? Where does it forage? Is it declining? Is it stable? And then also management recommendations. And in this example, uh, wood thrush actually has, I think it's a 12-page um, set of guidelines specifically for wood thrush, which is beyond the scope of our book, but we reference the fact that, in fact, I'll have it on the next slide, I guess. We reference that this bird in particular has detailed forest management plans that you can reference if you want to really focus on this bird. And so based on what we have, we've got some management recommendations for the stand and the birds. Single tree selection, release crop trees. We want to retain or encourage some aspen in that stand for diversity. We might want to girdle some trees, which basically means sort of killing them standing. We want those to sort of be cavity trees. We noted that we had a sort of lack of cavity trees, so that would be an example of one way you could create them. You could cut some trees and just have them lie on the ground. That would provide coarse woody debris for things like ruffed grouse and some of these other things that trees on the ground provide. We've got an opportunity to create gaps. We didn't have a lot of gaps necessarily, so we might create a few. Plant some conifers to get those conifer inclusions. And we might want to do something about that buckthorn on the stand. Whether or not we're going to do any sort of management, we just want to get it out of there because it will take over a forested area. And in the guidebook, you'll find information about silviculture, how to find a forester if you aren't a forester, you're a landowner, and some additional resources. So again, if you were specifically interested in wood thrush, you can see it's a bird that is the partners in flight consider it a species of high concern. In other words, it's doing poorly. It's also a Minnesota species of greatest conservation need. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can see that within the guidebook, you'll find information related to how best to manage for wood thrush or some of the other birds that might benefit from similar management techniques. So these community associates probably have slightly similar habitat requirements, and what benefits the wood thrush might also benefit some of these community associates. So there's really some key points for the Forestry for the Birds program and this guidebook. This guidebook or this program is a program, not just a document. So it's these webinars, it's workshops, it's getting the word out, it's providing opportunities to speak and bring this forth to a number of different audiences. Diversity of forest type, species, structure, age, all these components, diversity is key. If you only have one thing, that's fine, but you have to know that it's going to come at the cost of some other things that might be found in a landscape context, or you might want to do something different. And then it's important to know that our forest might only be part of a bird's life cycle. So, for example, birds that are going to migrate down to Mexico or Central America or the Caribbean or Texas for the winter, there isn't anything that a Minnesota forester or landowner can do much about what's going on in Texas or Mexico or Central America. So the idea is to put your attention and efforts towards what you have influence on. There are, I mentioned, a bunch of different resources that we really took some time to sort of collate. So it is links to websites, but there also might be links to apps or to hard copy books and things like that for finding a forester, how to ID birds, more about climate change, more about cost sharing, more about ecological information. A bunch of resources are in the tail end of this guidebook. So for more information, I would encourage you to go to the Forest Stewards Guild website, the Forestry for the Birds tab specifically. You can either click on this link or you can put your phone up to this QR code, which will bring you to the Forest Stewards Guild landing page for the Forestry for the Birds program. American Bird Conservancy, who was a key partner in this endeavor. Here's a link to their website, as well as the University of Minnesota Natural Resource Research Institute. You might be able to find some bird reports there and some other information. Again, my name was Christian Nelson. I'm the Lake States coordinator with the Forest Stewards Guild, and you are welcome to call or email me with any questions or anything else you would like. And again, here's a QR code to access the digital guidebook, or you can go to our website. And the Forest Stewards Guild's on a couple different social media platforms as well. So you can reach out to us and connect with us in a number of different ways. And I think I have like 120 seconds left for questions or something. So I'm going to get out of this and see if I can see the screen again. All right, here I am. So,
Yeah, thanks, Christian. And kind of on the topic of the guidebook, can anyone purchase a physical copy of the book? I know there's a big push of those orders here that we all got some. How can folks get a physical copy?
that is tricky. So we are struggling to find money. A number of different entities have purchased books in bulk, and they're planning to give them away at different workshops and things like that. Right now, logistically, we don't have books that you can purchase. I wish we did. So keep attending in-person workshops if you want to get your hands on hard copies. We hope to be able to get some funding and just print these out in mass and be able to give them away much more readily than we were able to now. But the PDF is nice, functional, and you can have it on your phone or on your desktop, and it's the same book. It's just on a PDF format. So that's all I can say for now. I really hope that in some number of months I can say like, oh, just give me a ring and we'll send one out to you. But that's funding dependent.
Thanks, Christian. And just a quick, before I get to Bob's question, I have pasted a link for requesting CEs for viewing this webinar. So just if you're trying to get some of those, just look at the chat there. And also throughout the talk, I think maybe 3 or 4 times I pasted that long list of resources that Christian shared at the top of the webinar. And so if you'd like the handy guide or even to view the actual PDF of the guide. So scroll back up in the chat and look at some of those resources there. And then a question here from Bob Perlenberg. Since the species richness is highest on the Ontario border, what's happening in Ontario? Are they experiencing the same declines?
I don't specifically know that answer about Ontario, but I would speculate that Ontario shares a similar forest type as a lot of Northeast Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, Michigan, and then off to the east. And I would assume that the trends that are happening on our side of the border are similar to the trends that are happening on the other side of that, artificial international border, as long as the forest types are relatively the same. that whole boreal area, including in Minnesota and northern Michigan, we're all experiencing climate change, warmer winters and things like that. And so it would be my guess, I don't honestly know the answer, but it would be my guess that the trends are very similar to our neighbors to the north.
And thanks, Christian. And I'm afraid we're a minute after the hour here. I'm going to have to call us there. I do see that some folks have raised their hands. Again, if folks would like to reach out to Christian, I can paste your email here real quick, folks. And next month we are off, so we are not going to have an August webinar as part of the SFAC's webinar series. But join us again on June 9th, I believe, at 9 a.m. that second Tuesday for the Be Forewarned update from Rebecca Montgomery, University of Minnesota. So thanks so much to folks for joining, and thanks again so much to Christian for joining us again here in maybe 8 months or so apart, and to provide this more robust update here to the guide. So thanks so much, Christian, and thanks to folks in chat. We'll see you in September.
Thank you so
Take
much for
care.
the opportunity and your interest, everyone.